Fascism, the buzzword of the current year. What does it mean? In this video, we will review an essay ghost-written for Benito Mussolini by Giovanni Gentile, titled The Doctrine of Fascism. This edition, by the Howell Church Library, claims that it is the most complete articulation of Mussolini's political views, and claims to be the only complete translation copied directly from an official fascist government publication from 1935. This translation also includes all of the endnotes from the original. The first section, titled The Doctrine of Fascism, outlines the ideology. Fascism, like any sound political theory, encompasses both action and thought. It rises in reaction to historical forces, and thus is correlated to contingencies of the world. But it also has an ideal, existing in a higher space as an expression of truth. It claims that in order to exercise a spiritual influence over the world by exerting your will over others, one must understand the world in which action will take place. There can be no conception of the state that is not also a conception of life itself. Fascism is a vision, but like any philosophy, it at least has the potential to manifest itself in the world. Thus, there are many practical expressions of fascism in institutions, but one can only truly understand it by considering it in relation to life itself. Fascism is a spiritual attitude. It not only sees individuals seeking their own pleasure, but also the nation and country, and individuals and generations, bound by moral laws and common traditions that seek to elevate them by suppressing basic instinct and achieving a higher life built on duty. The individual can surpass terrestrial bounds and achieve, by self-sacrifice and even death, the reunification of self-interest, a spiritual existence that is his value as a man. This spiritual reaction is a reaction to the materialism of the 19th century. Fascism, unlike those doctrines, does not place the center of life outside man, but says that a man by his own free will can and must create his own world. Fascism desires men to be active and to engage in action with all his energy. It wants him to be aware of and face the difficulties that he encounters. Life is a struggle in which a man must win himself a worthy place by fitting himself physically, morally, and intellectually to win it. As it is for the individual, it is also for the nation and all mankind. Thus, culture in all forms, such as art, religion, and science, are held in high esteem, as is education. Work is also to be valued, which is the means by which man subjugates nature and creates the human world, economically, politically, ethically, and intellectually. This positive conception of life is obviously an ethical one, so no action is exempt from moral judgment. Therefore, life is serious, austere, and religious. The world is sustained by moral and religious forces, so the easy life is disdained. Man exists in relation to higher law and has an objective that transcends the individual and elevates him into a spiritual society. Fascism is not only a system of government, but also a system of thought. The fascist conception of man is that he is only a man insofar as he contributes to the family, his social group, the nation, and mankind. Man is a non-entity outside of history, which is why great value is placed in traditions and language. The abstractions of 18th century individualism are rejected. All utopias are rejected, as well as the conception of happiness in the economic literature of this period. It rejects the theological notion that man will one day settle all difficulties, because this is contrary to the reality, which teaches that life is in a continual state of flux. Fascism aims at realism, and desires only to solve those problems which spontaneously arise as a result of history. A man can only act on man and nature by engaging directly with reality. Fascism is anti-individualistic and accepts the individual only so far as his interests coincide with those of the state, which is the conscience and universal will of man. It opposes classical liberalism, which stood against absolutism, but exhausted its function when the state became an expression of the conscience and will of the people. Liberalism denied the state in the name of the individual, but fascism reasserts the rights of the state as the true essence of the individual. If liberty is an attribute of living men and not of abstract dummies invented by individualistic liberalism, then fascism stands for liberty, the only liberty worth having, understanding, and that is of the state, and of the individual within the state. Fascism conceives of the state as all-encompassing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state is a synthesis of all values and instructs the people in them. Fascism rejects all groups outside of the state, including political parties, cultural associations, economic unions, and social classes. It thus opposes socialism since it amalgamates all classes into a single economic entity and sees history as nothing but a class struggle. Likewise, it is opposed to trade unions as a class weapon, but recognizing the real needs that gave rise to socialism and trade unions, it gives these needs due weight in the system of the state, in which divergent interests must harmonize. Individuals form classes, but first and foremost they form the state. The state is also not merely an expression of the majority. Fascism opposes this form of democracy. Rather, it is the purest form of democracy and is concerned with quality of opinion over quantity of opinion. The most ethical, most coherent, and most true become the mightiest, sometimes from the will of a few, or even one. The ends are to express these ideas in the conscience and will of the entire mass of people, who are not merely one race or geographical region, but a unified personality. This higher personality is the nation insofar as it is embedded in the state. Nations do not generate states. This is an antiquated 19th century understanding. Rather, it is the state that creates the nation, by a people aware of their moral unity. Thus, the right to independence does not arise from a literary and idealistic form of self-consciousness, but from an active political will asserting itself. Thus, the state, which is the expression of a universal ethical will, creates the right to national independence. A nation expressed in a state is only a living ethical entity insofar as it is progressive. Inactivity is death, so the state is not only the governing authority, but a power that makes its will felt beyond its borders, demonstrating proof of its character. This implies at least the potential of expansion, if not actualized. In this way, the state is equal to the will of man. His development cannot be checked by obstacles, and through achievements demonstrates its infinitude. The fascist state, as a higher expression of personality and a spiritual force, is not merely limited to keeping order and peace, as liberal doctrine has it, but it is an inwardly accepted discipline. It permeates the individual as much as their own intellect, being the central motive in the heart and soul of man. In short, fascism is not only a governing power, but an educator and promoter of spirituality. It aims to reshape the faith of man. To achieve this, it enters the soul with undisputed authority to enforce discipline. The next section is titled Political and Social Doctrine, and is the remainder of the work, sans the appendix. It is a more personal chapter, written in first person. Mussolini describes how the foundation of fascism had no specific doctrine. The only doctrine in which he had practical experience was socialism, and that was as a follower and a leader, not on a doctrinal level. His doctrine had been a doctrine of action. He describes how socialism had no universally accepted doctrine until 1905, and how the echoes of socialism have died, and by 1919 it was merely a grudge against those who had willed entry into the Great War. Fascism, initially, was not a doctrine drafted on a desk, but was action born of the need for action. It was not at first a party, but an anti-party. It was a series of pointers and forecasts that eventually developed into a political doctrine unlike all others. Mussolini cites one of his earlier essays, seemingly slightly abashed at his use of socialist terminology, such as bourgeoisie. He describes how the fascists, despite their opposition to socialism, were not friends of the bourgeoisie. They could also care less of the socialist criticisms of a regression to feudal economics. The fascists intended to seize power when the opportunity of succession was presented. Indeed, the opportunity was there, and he describes how in the years preceding the March on Rome, There was no time for careful deliberation. There was fighting and debate, but fascists had something powerful on their side, and that was a knowledge of how to die. In place of a fully elaborated doctrine, they had faith. One may be able to go back and select the books, articles, legislations, and speeches of those days, and one will find that these foundations were laid while the battle was raging. It was during this time that fascist thought armed, refined, and organized itself. Fascists discussed the problems of the individual, the state, authority, and liberty, as well as the conflict with liberal, democratic, and socialist doctrine. Nevertheless, the lack of a formal system led disingenuous adversaries to say that fascism was incapable of articulating a doctrine at the very time in which the doctrine was being conceived. Fascism, now clearly defined, is not only a regime, but a doctrine as well. It has exercised its critical faculties on itself and others, and from its special standpoint has the problems affecting nations of the world, and is ready to deal with them. Fascism differentiates itself from other philosophies by a disbelief in the possibility or even utility of perpetual peace. It discards pacifism as a cloak of the cowardly who are unwilling to self-sacrifice. War alone maximized human energy and seals the nobility of those who have the courage to face it. All other tests are substitutes, since they never make a man face life and death. Thus, peace at all costs is incompatible with fascism, as are international superstructures, which always crumble when nations are stirred by their own considerations. Such alliances are foreign to the spirit of fascism, even when accepted as useful for specific political situations. The anti-pacifistic attitude is carried into the individual as part of a fighting spirit that is a new style of Italian life. Fascists love life and view suicide as cowardly. Life is duty, elevation, and conquest. It must be lofty and full, and lived for oneself, but above all for others, near and far, past and present. The population policy of fascism is a consequence of these principles. Fascists love their neighbors, but this does not exclude severity. Fascism does not include universal embraces. It follows others and notes any changes in their interests. It is not deceived by mutable and fallacious appearances. This conception of life makes fascism the negation of Marxist socialism, which is a materialist doctrine that only explains history in the narrow terms of class struggle and changes in the instruments of production. The discovery of raw materials, new processes, and innovations are important, but to explain the totality of human history through the vicissitudes of economics at the exclusion of all else is absurd. Fascism believes in sanctity and heroism, which have no economic motive. Fascism denies that men are the puppets of materialist forces and the irreparability of the class struggle of this conception. Above all, it rejects that the class struggle is the primary agent in social transformation. It also rejects the sentimental aspiration that humanity will alleviate the suffering and sorrows of humbler folk. It rejects the idea that felicity is something to be achieved socialistically, almost automatically, at some given stage of economic evolution, where all will be assured material comfort. It denies that materialistic conception of happiness as an outdated model, which sees men as mere animals that can be sated by being fed and fattened. After socialism, fascism trains its guns on democratic ideology and rejects their premises and practical applications. It denies that numbers, as such, by periodical consultation, can be the determining factor in society. It asserts that the inequality of men cannot be leveled by any mechanism, such as universal suffrage. Democratic regimes are those under which people are deluded from time to time into believing that they exercise sovereignty, when in reality secret forces are in control. Democracy is a kingless regime infested with many kings, who are sometimes more tyrannical and destructive than one. This is why fascism abandoned that stance prior to the March on Rome, believing that the republican form of government is no longer of preeminent importance. The study of history shows that neither monarchy or republic are universal truths, but are forms of government expressing the political evolution, history, traditions, and psychology of a given country. Fascism outgrows the dilemma of monarchy versus republic. Democratic regimes attribute all of the inefficiencies of government to monarchies and republics as perfection. However, republics can be reactionary and absolutist, and monarchies can be socially and politically open and experimental. Mussolini cites the philosopher Renan, who he regards as having pre-fascist inclinations. Renan says that science and reason are the product of mankind, but reason should not be sought from the people directly. Reason's existence is not contingent on all people's familiarity with it, and even if all had to be initiated in it, democracy is not the appropriate vessel for this. The maxim that society exists only for the well-being and liberty of individuals does not conform with nature, which is willing to sacrifice the individual for the species. Renan also fears that the end of democracy is a form of society in which a degenerate mass has no thought beyond enjoying the ignoble pleasures of the vulgar. Returning to Mussolini himself, he says that fascism rejects the lie of political equality, collective irresponsibility, and the myths of happiness and indefinite progress. However, if democracy is understood to mean a regime in which the masses are not driven back to the margins of the state, then fascism has already been defined as an organized, centralized, authoritarian democracy. Fascism is absolutely opposed to liberalism. Its importance in the 19th century should not be exaggerated, nor should any one doctrine of that era be made a religion for all mankind. Liberalism only flourished for 15 years as a reaction to the Holy Alliance of Europe, which sought to regress Europe. Its zenith was in 1848, when Pope Pius IX was a liberal, and its decline was immediately thereafter. In 1849, the Roman Republic was destroyed by the Republic in France, and Marx wrote his famous Communist Manifesto, The Gospel of Socialism. In 1851, Napoleon led his illiberal campaign and ruled until 1870. Bismarck, who defeated him, never knew liberalism. Germany was entirely detached from liberalism, except for a parliament that lasted for only one season. They attained national unity without liberalism, and in fact, liberalism itself is foreign to the German temperament, which is monarchical, whereas liberalism is the anteroom to anarchy. The three stages of German unity were the wars of 1864, 1866, and 1870, led by Moltke and Bismarck. Italian unity also went mostly without liberalism, when its contributions are compared to those of Mazzini and Garibaldi. Without the illiberal Napoleon, Italy would not have Lombardy, and without the illiberal Bismarck, they would not have Venetia or Rome. Even the high priests of liberalism regard the years of 1870 to 1915 as the twilight of their religion, which was attacked by decadence in literature and activism, which is to say, nationalism, futurism, and fascism. Mussolini lays the responsibility of the Great War on the hands of liberalism. He says that the liberal century piled up innumerable Gordian knots, tried to cut them with the sword of a world war, and that never has a religion claimed such a cruel sacrifice. He asks if the gods of liberalism were thirsting for blood. Mussolini says that liberalism is now closing the doors of its temples, deserted by people who believe that its agnosticism in economics and indifference in politics and morals will lead the world to ruin again. He thinks that this is why the contemporary political experiments were anti-liberal, and that it is ridiculous to put them on the wayside, as if history is set aside for liberalism, and it is the last word on civilization. The fascist negation of socialism, democracy, and liberalism should not be interpreted as a desire to regress the world. Monarchical absolutism is of the past, as is ecclesiarchy. Feudalism and caste systems are finished, and neither is the fascist conception of authority a police state. A totalitarian government is a new departure in history, with no points of reference or comparison. Beneath the ruins of liberalism, socialism, and democracy, fascism extracts the vital elements. It preserves what may be called the acquired facts of history, and rejects all else. It rejects the idea of a doctrine suited to all times and all people. The 19th century was the century of socialism, liberalism, and democracy, but that does not mean that the 20th century must be the same. Doctrines pass and nations remain, and the 20th century may be the century of authority tending to the right, a fascist century. If the 19th century was the century of the individual, the 20th century may be the century of the collective, and therefore the century of the state. It is logical for a new doctrine to make use of the vital elements of other doctrines. No doctrine has ever been born entirely new and unheard of, boasting absolute originality. It is always connected with those that preceded it and those that will follow. Thus, the scientific socialism of Marx is linked to the utopian socialism of the Fouriers, the Owens, and the Saint-Simons. The liberalism of the 19th century traces its origins to the 18th century and the doctrines of its illuminated encyclopedists. All doctrines intend to direct the activities of men to a specific end, but these activities in turn react upon the doctrine, modifying it as new ends are needed. Therefore, a doctrine must be a vital act and not a verbal display. This is the reason for the pragmatism in fascism, which is its will to power, its will to live, its attitude towards violence, and its value. The keystone of fascism is its conception of the state. For fascism, the state is absolute. Individuals and groups are admissible insofar as they are aligned with the state. The liberal state restricts citizens and records results, whereas the fascist state guides the material and moral progress of the community. The fascist state has a will of its own, and because of this, it is an ethical state. Mussolini then transcribed some ideas that he articulated at the first quinquennial assembly of the regime in 1929. His words can be summarized as such. The fascist state is not merely concerned with the safety of the citizens, nor their material prosperity or peaceful conditions. Neither is it exclusively political, removed from the practical realities of the people and nation. The fascist state is spiritual and ethical for securing the political, juridical, and economic organization of the nation, which is the manifestation of the spirit. The state safeguards the safety of the country, but it also protects and transmits the spirit of the people, which is elaborated in their language, customs, and faith. The state is the past, present, and future. The state transcends individuals and is the conscience of the nation. The state educates its citizenry, making them aware of their mission and unifying them by harmonizing their interests. It transmits to future generations the achievements in the fields of science, art, law, and solidarity. It leads men from primitive tribal life to the highest manifestation of human power, imperial rule. It hands down to future generations the memory of those who laid down their lives to ensure its safety. It records for the future the names of heroes and geniuses who added territory and fame to the state. Whenever respect for the state declines and interest of individuals and groups prevail, the nation fails. Mussolini says that the importance of the state has been emphasized since 1929, and that the economic and political crisis of his contemporary time can only be solved by the state. He contrasts this with early liberalism, which said that states should endeavor to make themselves useless and avoid governing too much or interfering in the economy. He notes that the second generation of liberals were more compromising, and that even Adam Smith cautiously allowed for economic intervention. Individualism is to liberalism as government is to fascism. The fascist government is unique and original. It is not reactionary but revolutionary because it anticipates the solutions to universal problems that appear elsewhere. These are the division caused by political parties, the usurpation of power by parliaments, the irresponsibility of assemblies, the disputes of trade unions, and the need of order, discipline, and morality. Fascism desires a strong and organic state based on broad popular support. It lays no claim to rule the economy any more than other systems. It acts through social and educational institutions, with all the political, economic, and spiritual forces of the nation. A state based on millions of people who recognize its authority and are ready to serve its ends is not a tyrannical state like those of the medieval lords. It has nothing in common with such despotic states. The fascist state does not crush the individual, but multiplies their energies, just as a soldier is not diminished by his fellow soldiers. The fascist state organizes the nation, but gives individuals adequate liberty. It restricts harmful freedoms while preserving necessary ones. As to which are essential, the individual cannot be the judge, only the state can. Fascism is not indifferent to religion. Roman Catholicism is the religion of Italians. That state has no theology, but it does have a moral code, and religion is regarded as one of the deepest manifestations of the spirit, so it respects and defends it. Fascism does not seek to set up its own god or a race god, but to respect God. The fascist state intends to exercise power and command. This is the Roman tradition of strength in which imperial power is not merely territorial, military, or commercial, but also spiritual and ethical. An imperial nation, which is a leader of other nations, can exist without conquering any territory. The imperial spirit is a manifestation of vitality. Limiting interest to the home country is decadence. Only imperial people will rise. Imperialism implies discipline, coordination, and a deep sense of duty, and a spirit of self-sacrifice. Mussolini says that the people have an unprecedented thirst for authority, direction, and order. If each age has a doctrine, then the doctrine of his contemporary age is fascism. Its vitality is proven by its basis in faith, and its heroes and martyrs. Fascism has ascended to live amongst the other ideologies that have expressed themselves in a moment of human history. This concludes the doctrine itself. I will now review the endnotes. These notes reference various parts of the text, and thus will seem somewhat disjointed in a vacuum, but nonetheless you should be able to understand which parts of the doctrine they are elaborating on. So I will just go ahead and read them out in order. The first note is on the philosophical conception of fascism. The note says that fascism must establish a doctrine if it does not wish to die, but it must not be an immutable construct. It must be a norm to guide daily life. The fundamentals of the doctrine will likely remain unchanged, but it should be revised as necessary. The regions of Italy especially must cooperate in developing fascism. It must also be shown that fascism is not a party of violent men, but also of meditative intellectuals. However, this will not diminish the fighting spirit of fascism, but empower its soldiers to be fully conscious of their cause. Fascism is universal. It is Italian in its particular institutions, but it is universal in spirit, and the spirit is universal in nature. Therefore, Europe may become fascist in its entirety. The second note is on the spiritual conception of fascism. The note says that in the place of materialism is a spiritualism that rejects the democratic spirit and all of its peculiar components, such as easygoingness, improvisation, and a lack of personal responsibility, and the exaltation of numbers and the people. God is returning in the face of anti-religious attitudes. Science can only be led to enlightenment by philosophy. Fascism possesses a great spiritual depth. It is not only a revolt against a weak government that has allowed the state to decay and thus halted progress, but also a spiritual revolt against the corruption of religion and faith. It is a revolt of the people. The third note is on fascism's positive conception of life, that of a struggle. Struggle is the origin of all things, and until all things are balanced, struggle will remain as an essential human nature. However, this is a good thing. Wars, economic battles, and conflicts of ideas are to be indulged in, and without struggle there would only be melancholy and ruin. Attempting to bring calm, peace, and tranquility is contrary to the direction of the world, and would only lead to an unpreparedness for struggles. Peace will only come if people reach the Christian dream of universal brotherhood, but Mussolini does not believe such a day will come, although he does not rule it out entirely. The honor of nations consists of the contributions they have made to human civilization. The fourth note is on the ethical conception of fascism. Life is a continuous fight, which will be accepted easily and with courage. The fifth note is on the religious conception of fascism. If fascism were not a creed, then its followers could not be endowed with such great courage and stoicism. Only a religion can inspire such things. The sixth note is on the historical and realistic conception of fascism. Tradition is one of the greatest spiritual forces of the people, insofar as it is a creation of their soul. The temperament of fascists leads them to assess the concrete aspects of problems, rather than their ideological or mystical components. Fascists can thus easily regain their balance. The fascist battle is an ungrateful one, yet is beautiful because of its dependence on one's own forces. They tear to shreds revealed truths, dogmas, theories, and charlatans who sell programs of happiness. Fascists reject the promised land, the idea of happiness and salvation. They do not believe in singular or linear solutions to any problems, because life is not linear and can never be reduced to such. Fascists do not seek to be mechanical drones fixated on a single horizon, but living men who wish to give their contribution to history, however modestly. Fascism will uphold the moral and traditional values rejected and despised by socialism, and is horrified at arbitrary ideas on the mysterious future. In spite of their conservation of tradition on the right and renovation of progress on the left, fascists do not cling to the past, yet neither do they spring into the future. The seventh note is on individualism and liberty. Fascists declare that they are the first to state, in the face of democratic liberalism, that the individual only exists within the state. The sense of the state grows in the mind of Italians, because they feel that it alone can safeguard their independence and the continuity of their future existence. The fascists claim that based on the success of the last 8 years, the next 80 years will see Italy become grandiose if the citizens remain in concordance with the state being their sole arbitrator, and that no individuals will exist outside of the state except for savages in the solitude of deserts. Fascism has restored the sovereignty of the state by declaring its absolute ethical position against the egoism of classes. The state, diminished to an instrument of assemblies, has been restored its dignity as a representative of the personality of the state and its power. The moral character of fascism cannot be denied. The state would be nothing without its own spirit and morality, which manifests in the laws it creates. The state's ethical character is Catholic, but fascist above all. Catholicism completes fascism and cannot overturn it. A state is aware of its mission and is not a mere administrator, but a transformer of the people. Freedom is not absolute, because nothing is absolute. Freedom is not a right, it is a privilege. Freedom is bound by duty, and varies in time of peace and war, and prosperity and poverty. Individuals in fascist states are more free because they are protected. Isolated men are not free. Italy was reunited as a fascist state. The fascist state is a unity of classes, and the unity of the people in every aspect is only realized in a fascist state. The eighth note is on the conception of a corporative state. Not since Italian Empire has Italy been a united state. The state controls all natural political, moral, and economic forces, and therefore the fascist state is a corporative state. The fascist state is the antithesis of democracy, plutocracy, Freemasonry, and liberalism. Corporations are not bureaucratic, and do not wish to disrupt organizations that are necessarily independent, since they aim at improving their members. Corporations balance interests, and only the state can balance contrasting interests to achieve higher aims. The fact that all organizations exist within fascism speeds up their progress. The corporative and fascist state concentrates, controls, harmonizes, and tempers all interests, thus protecting all equally. Under democratic liberal regimes, the labor class was outside and against the state, whereas in fascist Italy, the workers all seek a place in the corporative state of fascism. The ninth note is on democracy. The war against democracy is revolutionary in that through bloodshed, democracy has been done away with. Race is a feeling and not a reality. The 10th note is on the conception of the state. A nation exists insofar as it is a people. People rise when they are numerous and well-regulated. Power is the outcome of this. Civil society cannot exist without a state. The nation is mainly spiritual and not territorial. There have been many states with vast territory that left no imprint in history, and there have been small states that left immortal achievements. The greatness of a nation is the combination of its virtues and conditions. A nation is great when the power of its spirit manifests in reality. The nation must be unified in a sovereign state, which achieves the moral continuity of the nation. Without the state, there is no nation, merely aggregations of humans subject to disintegration. The 11th and last note is on dynamic reality. If a people wish to live, they must have a will to power. Otherwise, they will vegetate, live miserably, and become prey. Fascism has refashioned the character of Italians, removing impurity, tempering them, and restoring their strength and beauty. The character and significance of fascism is not merely ceremonial, but it will educate and prepare the people, which is one of the fundamental duties of the state. If the state does not fulfill this duty, then it forfeits its right to exist. I hope you have found this summary of the doctrine of fascism useful in better understanding this ideology. Thank you for watching.